Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode talking about hamstrings and hind-end harmony and how to spot dysfunction in your horse. The hamstrings are an area that are really important for hind limb function. They are important for power production, stability, ability to engage, and they're a really good indicator when functioning well for postural function. So how are you going today, Sophie?
Hey, Raquel. I'm going well. This conversation is one that we've had actually lots of times, both in the course and just in discussion, because they're so important. The hamstrings themselves are a group of muscles in the hind limb. They go down the back of the hind leg, and they have loads of different functions, and they're recruited for lots of different complex actions. And commonly, they have issues popping up as well. So I think something that people recognize about the hamstrings is always the term poverty lines. It's a strong muscle division, and it's been pointed out there's lots of correlations talked about between weight and poverty lines, presence, different breeds of horses, thoroughbreds, as opposed to, say, a quarter horse, or developing them for muscle. But we're going to go further into that today and especially talk about the balance of their hamstrings with other muscles and how important that is.
Yeah, and I think it's valuable to recognize that a poverty line is not a healthy postural indicator, but it's something that's really common, especially if you want to see what we mean, you just go and look at racing thoroughbreds. Like they, due to a product of their function, and often sacropelvic dysfunction, they have tight hamstrings with an obvious poverty line. And what usually goes with that is very weak quads. So they're very floppy at the front of the limb coming up from the stifle to the point of hip, which is the point of the pelvis. They often also have really weak glutes, so over the top of the rump. And so, that'll be a typical, and they have a weak top line generally when they have a poverty line as well. And so what we would like to see through there is lovely smooth musculature, that the hind end musculature is difficult to see the lines between the muscles, so that it's smooth, full without looking tight and overdeveloped, and there's a balance between those quads, hamstrings, and glutes. And if you see that, especially in a young horse and you're looking at purchasing a horse, it's something to look for when you're purchasing a young horse. What is that balance of those muscles like in that hind end? Because it gives you a really good idea of the function of hips, stifles, hocks, lumbosacropelvic area. Because if those muscles are well developed and functioning optimally, it's supporting all of those joints.
Definitely. And, there's a big difference when you're talking about, you're possibly looking at a horse to purchase, or even when you're assessing your own horse and you're talking about having a good engagement of those muscles in relationship to a whole system that's working well. You're looking for the difference between muscles that are overloaded. So hamstrings often are loaded, they're under tension, and they're not well engaged or conditioned. So
even though they often look large.
Even though they look large. And so even if you have, if you've got hamstrings that are overloaded, often horses lean back on them. They're kind of used almost like a lever system. They're kind of tense and holding a system together rather than being in a position that they are ready to spring into action and they have the ability to lengthen and contract and be powerful or mobile and flexible. So that's kind of the difference between a well-functioning area and a not well functioning area. What are the three components of the hamstring group?
Yeah, so the three muscles that are involved in the hamstrings are the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. And that's basically going from the outside of the leg over the hip to the inside. So I always remember semimembranosus with the M being medial, which means towards the midline of the horse. And they have really important roles in hind limb motion, so the ability to retract the hind limb, create propulsion, create hip extension and stability in the push of the hind limb, as well as and stability of the hip, as well as stifle flexion and hock flexion and extension as well. So if we go from the outside to the inside, so biceps femoris, I think what's important to note with biceps femoris is that it, but all of the hamstrings have multiple points of attachment, and both proximally towards the body and distally towards the limbs. And they are influencing all of those joints. So the sacroiliac joints, the hip joint, the stifle joint, and the hock joint. The biceps femoris attaches at the sacrum and the tail, as well as attachments into fascia and ligaments, specifically the sacroiliac ligaments. But a primary attachment for it is the pelvis, the tuba ischi, which is the point of buttock. And that's a really common fulcrum point for damage. So I see a lot of kind of strain at the tuba ischi, which is the point of buttock, in the biceps femoris and semitendinosus and semimembranosus. They all have an attachment onto that point of buttock, but just in different positions. And they've got to move across it as a fulcrum. Then the biceps femoris comes down below the stifle. It splits so that it comes to the front of the stifle, and it also goes to the calcanean tendon to the hock. So it's having a real influence there on both extension of the hind limb and abduction, so bringing the hind limb to the body. Abduction, the hind limb away from the body. And hip stifle and hock extension, but it's important in stifle extension and flexion, just to be confusing. It's, a lot of muscles are flexors or extensors, but the biceps does both, and it's really, really powerful. And I see a lot of issues in the biceps over the hip joint and in the junction between the biceps femoris and the semitendinosus. A lot of fascial damage through there, fascial tension, and it really has a massive influence on the hip function. So what about the semitendinosus? So the next one around.
So semitendinosus is, just to distinguish again, semimembranosus and semitendinosus are two that run together, and they sound the same, but tendinosus is actually in the middle of the biceps and the semimembranosus. So its proximal attachments, the ones up in the body, come from the sacrum and the tail vertebra, but also the tail fascia and also the sacrosciatic ligament. But just like the biceps, the primary attachment for it is the tuba ischi, or the ischiatic tuberosity. And the distal attachment is the tibial crest, the crural fascia, the lateral crural fascia, and also the calcaneus. So that's the basically the bone that supports the point of the hock, basically all the tendons and stuff that run over that. And the role of the semitendinosus is to extend the hip and the hock while flexing and flexing the stifle as well. So, you know, the semitendinosus is a place that you often see. It looks very stringy when you have a feel of it, but it's just, I would say the semitendinosus is one that when you feel all the way down it and you can't distinguish the semimembranosus from the semitendinosus, often there's like almost a scar tissue down between them when you see fibrotic myopathy, which we'll talk about a bit later on anyway. But so the semimembranosus, do you want to explain semimem?
Yeah. So the semimembranosus is the medial hamstring, so inner hamstring. It also attaches into the sacrosciatic ligament, which is a primary attachment point for the semimembranosus. So it's got a major attachment into a sacroiliac ligament, as well as the tail vertebrae and the medial ischiatic tuberosity. So you can see how then the movement of the pelvis for the hamstrings is really important, because as that ischiatic tuberosity moves, if there's tension in its attachment point, then there's going to be strain there, and it's a really common area for strain. And then it goes down onto the inner aspect of the femur, so at the back, on the inner aspect of the gastroc area, as well as the medial stifle collateral ligament and the medial kind of stifle aspect in there. And so it can become under strain when there's stifle issues and it's trying to stabilize the stifle. Its function is to adduct the hind limb, so keep it closer to the body and extend the hip. The thing, as Sophie said, is that those tendons become, so the tendon of the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps become quite thin down there. And so when there is restriction and that leg comes under strain, like especially in sliding stops, or especially when horses just run around the paddock and do their own slideys in the mud, they can get scarring, and it can lead to fibrotic myopathy, where it becomes fibrous and you can get a slight slapping motion of the leg. And sometimes it's really obvious and you can feel it, and sometimes we've seen it under dissection where the fibrotic myopathy is quite deep in the tendons. And so, yeah, that's, the hamstrings are an indicator if you have a slapping motion of the foot. And, you know, Jelly, for example, when his hamstrings are not functioning optimally, I can see a slight slapping. And then when I, you know, get them functioning optimally again, it goes away. So his is more, he gets tension in his hamstrings relating to his muscle disorder, as opposed to horses where they've just got chronic scarring and you can't get rid of it. You can just manage it. So they're the attachments. The hamstrings are also involved in the myofascial lines, specifically the dorsal line, and the deep and superficial dorsal line and the spiral line. So if there's things going on in the hamstrings, it's basically what we're saying is going to have an influence on the back all the way to the head, and it's going to have an influence through, you know, the entire body due to the spiral line, which crosses the body 3 times. And so there could be quite a complex pattern going on with the body, you know, relating to the hamstrings or causing compensations through the hamstrings. Do you want to add anything else about their connections, function?
The myofascial line connections between the hamstrings directly into the sacrum as well, the deep and the superficial dorsal lines, they go sort of superficially along the back and then deep on top of the spine as well, like along the multifidi there. So often you know, the sacrum itself can become incredibly blocked. So it's the sacropelvic function. When you see symptoms like the sacrum doesn't have a lot of motion when you're standing behind the horse, or you know, an exaggerated motion, often the tension coming through the hamstrings is a really strong influencing factor through that entire space. When you think about the links to the pelvic functions in terms of the sacroiliac ligaments, what kind of, you know, things do you see popping up?
I think, you know, probably the biggest issue is in the attachments of those hamstrings. So specifically, you know, to the sacrum, the sacroiliac ligaments. And when I'm working with the hamstrings, it's a balance of getting function within the hamstring muscles themselves, and then getting function back into the sacrum and the pelvis and the lumbosacral area. You know, I was actually treating a horse this morning who's had quite chronic postural restrictions, like whole body restrictions, and she had no ability to stabilize. She couldn't stand still, like really poor ability to posturally stabilize. And it's interesting, you know, as we're balancing up her body. So this morning, working, you know, more on pelvic balance, I mean, whole body, but getting that function back in her lumbar and her pelvis and her hamstrings, because they were tight but not working, floppy quads,
Yes.
weak glutes, tight, inactive hamstrings. She couldn't extend her leg out the back, so they were kind of in a chronic, you know, stuck under her body. And she was like sitting on me this morning to just enable those hamstrings to actually release and come back into function. And so, you know, then it was a matter of kind of balancing the function of the hamstrings with the pelvis and the sacrum. Whereas sometimes I see another presentation where the attachments are raised at the sacrum. And so you'll see there's like a difference in tone where the hamstrings attach to their attachment points compared to the rest of the hamstring. So you'll feel like they're really tight in their attachments, but then you go down the bottom and they're like floppy and flaccid.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, you know, we're trying to get those back to a point where A, the points that they attach to functions, and B, that we get a uniformity in the tone of those muscles, because you can't have optimal function in those muscles if the entire muscle can't function optimally. And so that's another really common presentation that I see, is a real difference in the attachment, like a strain to the attachment points, or especially
And the distinction between especially the biceps being used for so many different functions, if you think that, you know, a certain function is not working very well and another area is, what part of that muscle might be having issues through there. In terms of signs of dysfunction and compensation, obviously there's lots of things that come alongside sacropelvic dysfunction. Some behavioral signs that people often might see are irritability to touch. So they can be quite sensitive, especially like if they're very stringy, or I see often with that extreme tension, you know, just beside the tail, when you come into that space, sometimes it can either be really itchy as well, you know, as some feeling comes back into there. But when you go to work in that space, it can be, you know, the horse can react strongly to that.
Yeah, sometimes they'll like shoot away from you almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
When there's a lot of tension through that sacrotuberous ligament under the tail there.
You also commonly see a reluctance to engage the hind end. So obviously the muscles have a strong relationship to being able to collect and come underneath or have power. So difficulty with transitions can also be an issue, and often kicking out, which you do see either in session. I think a few horses, when you really get deep into possible fibritic myopathy, often they'll kick at the ground. I know I've seen like a lot of, it almost seems like they're having a flush of circulation return or fascial changes, and they need to really move the leg, but also being ridden, kicking out can be quite common.
Yeah, I think with that too, we need to consider the compression to the nerves. Like because the biceps femoris, so basically the junction of the biceps femoris and the back of the biceps, and then you've got the junction to the semitendinosus, the sciatic nerve sits right under there at the back of the hip. And so if you've got tight, weak hamstrings, you could have sciatic pain in the horse. So the stomping could be also, nerve changes in the nerve function, and compression, changes in the sciatic nerve, like compression. And so we've really got to consider how it's impacting those nerves and how much tension it's creating around them, because especially that junction is really important for sciatic nerve function.
And I suppose the sciatic nerve is exiting through that sacrotuberous ligament, which also has a strong connection in, and is a form of attachment for the hamstrings as well. So super connected. In terms of postural clues, what kind of dysfunctional compensation can you see?
Well, I think just that weakness through the gluteal area, and then those overdeveloped hamstrings, or the lack of uniformity in hamstring presentation. Like you've got a big, tight, bulgy bit at the top, and then they kind of just fall away as you go. So like around the tuber ischii, it's kind of bulgy and prominent, and then you look kind of down towards the back of the stifle, and there's nothing much there. And the same with, like, you'll have those weak floppy glutes as well, and they'll often just look weak behind with extreme poverty lines, and then like they're loading up their front end more, which obviously is not always hamstring dysfunction. It can be other issues like sacroiliac ligament issues, other kind of pain in the hind end. But it's one of the potential things that can cause hamstring, that can show up with hamstring issues. And then, how does that kind of transmit through to motion?
So commonly you'll see a poor quality canter, a shortened stride, and also dragging the toes behind.
Yeah, especially if they can't extend the limb forward.
Yes, with reach, which, if you have a tight muscle, is unlikely you're going to have good mobility through it and reach. There's often poor hock flexion, and also the reduced ability to absorb motion and engage the hind end. So they're quite choppy, and it just doesn't look comfortable to, load into those spaces, particularly, coming the fascial connection even down through the tendons into the back of the hind limb and the hind limb suspensories. If you don't have that space functioning well, coming in to load them to absorb the motion coming up through the hind end is just, one is not going to happen. But if you ask them to, they're going to brace and find a way around it. Often overloading the front end, you're just talking about them being on the forehand in movement. Even if you do have other issues that are causing them to be on the forehand, it usually means that you can't engage the hamstrings well, though. So they aren't going to be used in a way that they can develop, which is what you're aiming for if you're trying to build strength back there.
Yeah, and I've had I've treated a lot of horses with scars in their hamstrings. So with those ones, you might get that slapping motion. So just looking at how they're bringing the leg through, and you can get a shortness in the stride, like especially the cranial phase of the stride. And I also had one a couple of years ago. They don't know exactly what happened, but she damaged the nerves in the sacrum, and she ended up with a huge amount of wastage through her biceps, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. So She also lost tail tone and lost the ability to poo and wee by herself appropriately. She's still alive. And the last time I saw her, she was pooing by herself and weeing by herself, but it was a really long process. And so, if you get, and we assume that she kind of went down with her tail on top of a bar, and so she's caused a sacral dysfunction that way. But yeah, if you see like wastage, really obvious wastage happening quite quickly, then you're thinking nerve injury as well. So she was probably the worst one I've seen because of the influence on tail and urination and defecation function. But there's a lot of causes of hamstring issues. So sliding and slipping, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Slipping in the mud, cantering into the gate, put the brakes on. Yeah, good way to damage the hamstrings.
Yeah, especially when it's a bit muddy and everyone's racing around.
Yeah, they just close your
Right.
eyes and ask that everyone stays on their feet.
Yeah.
Sliding stop. So, things like reining, cattle work, camp drafting, where horses are doing quick stops and turns. Your horses need to be really well warmed up. It's a great way to damage the hamstrings. And yeah, I think a big, and then when the hamstrings become tight and damaged, you're compromising your hocks and stifles.
Yeah. And what about, other external influences like tack?
Yeah, I mean, saddle fit, rider balance is going to have a massive impact on how the horse is able to use their hind end.
Yeah.
And so if there's a saddle fit issue, then they're not going to be able to engage. And so then that sets up a poor pattern of use of the muscles in the hind end, like the quads can't engage, the hamstrings become tighter, and you just get this imbalance of function through that hind end. And I'll just also talk about scars for a minute, because I've had heaps of hamstring scars. So many. And they're often around the point of buttock. It's a very common area. And I have one horse in particular who has a massive scar, as big as a orange. And over time, we've softened it, but you'll never get rid of that scar tissue. So you want to try to recognize that when it happens, rather than once it's already, you've got scar tissue. Because if you can, I've had others where we've picked up a strain straight away and we've addressed it and it hasn't turned into scar tissue because we've been able to keep healthy muscle. But with her, she loves to run. She's a quarter horse. She loves to run. She loves to run into the gate and do slippy slidies because she's a quarter horse. And, she, because of that scar, she did her accessory ligament in her hip and was really lame for a long time. We've stabilized her now, like she's in her 20s. She's not ridden. But, and I have another horse the same, not with the scar like that in the hamstrings, but slippy slidies has also damaged the accessory ligament in the hip. And you really need good quality hamstrings and quads and sacropelvic function to support that. And yeah, it's really been a struggle for him to build up his core strength with those kind of aspects. So recognizing hamstring injuries early is very, very valuable for the future of your horse.
And it's certainly something that you see commonly, just as an inadvertent thing that you even could brush away when you're standing behind a horse and they are in the exact moment where one hind limb is the most protracted it's going to be, like right as it's about to hit on the ground, and you're having a look from behind. If you examine the point of the buttock, that tuber issue where we talked about all the attachments, so many primary attachments, often there'll be like a dimpling or a line appears there, and
much more emotion. Yeah.
In that point, and it's often asymmetrical. So it's more on one side than the other. And when you have a really good feel in there, and you can ask your body worker to have a solid feel in there, if you see something like that, there's often ropiness, or there'll be lumps and bumps, or it feels tight in that space. But, horses that race in one direction often will, there's a pattern of it showing up on a certain side. They've just been reaching so far, and that lever point is under so much strain. And that is another reason why it's so important to have function in those muscles and core strength, and good lumbosacral motion before you ask your horses to work, and then to be under extreme load as you build up. If you don't have decent core strength, you can't engage your back. And if you can't engage through your back, you can't really engage your pelvis. And so that point between the lumbar and the sacrum, and that whole sacropelvic region, really needs decent lumbosacral motion for you to be able to tuck your bum under and use your hamstrings well, or to be able to extend out the back. The pelvis has a little bit of motion that it needs to do as your hind limb, extends. And then as those muscles are functioning doing that, if you don't have a decent system, nothing is really working optimally. And when it's working optimally is when you find your improved posture over time. So, it's a whole system, and the hamstrings are often a symptom when they're dysfunctional if you haven't had a traumatic injury. So
yeah, and also when you're talking about the pelvic function, if a horse does not have appropriate lumbosacral pelvic function, then often they don't have the stability through that hind end, and it comes back to core strength as well. So what you're saying about core strength, and this is why it's so important to build that core strength before asking for strength at stretch. So putting the limbs under more load, especially in bigger ranges of motion, because horses that don't have that good core strength and stability will slide a little bit with the hind legs. So, instead of landing and then like coming into weight bearing and then pushing, as they land, there can be a slide forward, and that's a great strain on the hamstrings. And so we, especially, with jumpers, like I've had some horses slide and fall because they're lacking stability from old pelvic injuries. And yeah, like you really want to see that when they land, they land and they support and they push, not they land and they slide. So really, you can look at that in the walk and check that they're not sliding in the walk, because if they're sliding in the walk and you increase load, they're probably going to slide in other gaits. So that for me is a big indicator or problem. The other thing I would say is I've had a few horses now which I had treated previously, so I knew they had hamstring damage, injury, scarring. And one horse, the one I was talking about before, the quarter horse, she did a crazy running episode in a round yard. Like, just owner couldn't stop her, she just lost her brain for, I can't remember the reason. Something triggered her. Anyway, after that point, head shaking. So, and it took longer than what it took for that to occur. It took quite a few months to sort that head shaking out, because it just established this whole fascial pattern. The trigeminal nerve become really irritated, and it links back into those myofascial chains that we talked about, and the dorsal lines coming through the hamstrings going all the way up to the head and to that jaw and trigeminal nerve area, which we'll do a podcast on head shaking. And then I had another one. So I knew she'd had hamstring damage in the previous years. I'd known her since she was much younger. And it was the same thing. She was in a lesson. They were working her quite hard, asking for quite a lot of engagement. The rider felt something shift, and then at that point she became a head shaker. So, I think there is a real link between the hamstrings and head shaking. And, if you like, we're going to do a podcast on head shaking, but we just need to consider that fascial link there if your horse has got hamstring scarring, especially.
There's such, it's so easy once you've had an empathetic experience. Like for me, I have a left medial hamstring old injury that flares up, especially if I don't warm up enough before I go into doing not enough stretching, before I jump straight into, doing some, I suppose, like squatting down on one leg. And then if I like load over onto the other leg before I've done enough stretching of that space and warming it up, it hurts for quite a few days, but it's not the area that bothers me the most. It's my left, like on the inside of the arch of my foot.
Yeah, so
It's
that
really sore.
fascial connection.
It's so predictable now. I know I'm like, oh, I'm going to have a sore foot there. I'm going to, put my extra inserts in my shoes, because the pull that it creates from that one space, it's deeply connected. And obviously, like, that hamstring stops at my knee, but that space all the way down my leg is being influenced fascially. It's so hard. And then because of that, I roll off my arch and I load the outside of my foot, and then the
Sets up a
outside
whole new
it
pattern.
begins to ache, and I have to be like, oh, I'm gonna sit down and work my foot so that I land on it normally. So it's just it's
And
so
that happens
connected.
in horses as well. Like you'll often see when they've got hamstring tension. Had one yesterday. He's a little rat bag in the paddock, and he runs around. And he does a lot of contortion moves, and he gets a lot of stuff around his hips. And so at the start of the session, he's standing there with his toes digging into, because we were in the arena, so he could really see how his toes were digging in. And then as we kind of released through his hamstrings, his feet came back into a more normal position. So that's another indicator of hamstring tension. If you see the horse really digging in the toes, in the back toes, it's most obvious in sand. So what kind of things you just mentioned there, that you need to warm up your hamstrings and do some lengthening before work. So now, what can people do to help their horses?
So number one, favorite across the board, postural balance and function. Everything that we talked about with the core strength and the lumbosacral motion, the fascial connections along the back and the spiral line, it's so connected that you want to be supporting the rest of the body with the hamstrings and supporting the hamstrings with the rest of the body. So having good posture and function is super key. Observing the balance of the hamstrings and the quads is also very important. You explained how there's often a floppy set of quads in that space above the stifle, and then the hamstrings can be, they feel tight and pronounced. Finding a balance there and asking your body worker, your trainer, bringing it up with them, because bringing your team in on that issue is going to bring awareness, and then you can all monitor that. You've talked so just then, you've had like a handful of examples where you've seen a horse who has had a change based on hamstring injury, or something else has popped up when it's flared up, or healthy posture, the hamstrings improve. So there's a lot to observe with the hamstrings. And also, I would say asking your body worker the next time they come out, can you have an inspection of my quads? They're an area that, if you think your pelvis isn't engaging as well as it could be, can you have a really good feel through those hamstrings? Do they feel well? What's their mobility like? What would you tell people to do?
Yeah, I think also learning how to do some hind limb mobilization. So, bringing the hind limb forward and back, obviously specifically forward for lengthening the hamstrings. Knowing how to do that appropriately so that your horse doesn't overload your back, but also that you don't create damage in the horse if you don't want them to lose control and slam their leg down. Making sure the horse is well warmed up, especially before you're going to do things like cutting, reining, camp drafting, jumping, anything that's going to have propulsive stops and starts. Like if you were racing, if you're racing thoroughbreds, then you want to make sure the horse is really well warmed up to make sure that the pelvis is, pelvic function is warmed up, hamstrings are warmed up, and doing things like activations, learning how to do hind limb activations so that you can switch on, like you can check, are the glutes working? Are the quads working? You know, how do I assess that in my horse properly? And, you know, I even know for myself the benefit of doing activations. You know, they don't take me long. And I also know the benefits for my horse. So, you know, knowing how to switch on the muscle, so working with someone, a professional who can teach you those, knowing how to do hind limb mobilizations appropriately so that you can lengthen the hamstrings, and then being able to do some basic hamstring massage. So on the Equinology website, they have the hamstring walk. Just be careful when you're going down the lower aspect. If the horse is really tight, always be mindful. Always start with less pressure than more in case they're really sore. But the hamstring walk is a really lovely thing to do for your horse's hamstring. It's not walking the horse, it's an actual massage technique using your body. And then creating variation in training so that your horse is, you know, if you're going to go jump them in sand, but you don't have an arena, you need to be, you know, finding some sand that you can train them in, or mimicking that so that you're not just going out jumping them in deep sand and then not working in that way. So being aware of the workload that you're asking them to do in competition and how you're mimicking that in your training, and how you're making sure that the hind limb is stepping up and under and not just pushing from behind, because that's really common that they're pushing from behind and they don't have strength when the hind leg comes through. And so that's a great way to damage the hamstrings when they're lacking that stability as the hind limb comes through to land and push. You want to know that there is stability in that foot, in that leg.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're just working with your body workers and to maintain that optimal function.
Going through. So, I mean, hamstrings are just so important for every horse. I think that if you listen to this podcast, you should go out and watch your horse walk around and observe their hamstrings as they're going, because it's something that, you know, nearly every horse you see, you can make a comment about them in some form or another. What would you say our key takeaways are for today?
I would say, yeah, have a feel and observe, because when your horse is walking, sometimes you can see what you said, those little dimples, and so they can be indicators of deeper scarring. And the hamstrings are massive muscle bulks. You know, they're some of the biggest muscle bulk in the body, and so sometimes you can't, especially when they're tight, you can't always feel the damage, like the scarring, but you can sometimes see it when they move, like you'll see a dimple. And so just getting familiar with what your horse's hamstrings feel like before and after riding, and learning how to recognize subtle signs and how to warm your horses up appropriately. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening to myself, Dr. Raquel Butler, and Sophie Vandenberg in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse time. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes, and give us a 5-star rating so we can share more valuable insights.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.